I'd like to introduce the next topic that I wanted to talk about, which is peak oil. Now, earlier I promised to talk a little bit more about what peak oil is, so let's look at that. Peak oil is the time when the maximum rate of global petroleum extraction is reached, after which the rate of production enters terminal decline. Now, that's from Wikipedia, which I normally wouldn't quote, but that was the best one-sentence encapsulation of what peak oil is that I could find. Basically, the idea is that we will eventually reach a point of maximal extraction for petroleum resources, and then availability is going to go down after that. And that's going to have some pretty sizable repercussions for an industrialized world economy. So I'd like to take a quote from the World Energy Council's report from 2007. It is important to recognize first that there is an oil age, which in fact promises to be a relatively brief chapter in human history. And second, that inevitably the oil age is divisible into a first half, when discovery and production rise, and a second half when they decline. These are pretty cut and dried concepts. There is nobody who can reasonably debate that we're not eventually going to reach a maximal point of extraction, or that we will eventually run out of oil if we continue to extract past that point. It's simply a physical reality of dealing with a finite resource on a finite planet. That's not in debate. So the real question, the real $10,000 question, is when peak oil is going to occur. And let's have a look at some production figures. The short answer to when peak oil is going to happen is that it will be soon if it hasn't happened already. And I say this for a number of reasons. One, oil discovery peaked in the 1960s. That is, we never discovered more oil in 1 year than we did in 1961. So that was the rate at which new oil was being discovered in the ground before it could be extracted. Oil production surpassed discovery in 1981, 1981 being the first year that more oil was pulled out of the ground than was found in new reserves, the point where discovery and production curves crossed one another. And here's a graphical depiction of that. You can see here the rate of discovery there in the gray bars, and the rate of extraction on the black dots on that line there. And you can see both the peak in oil discovery in the 60s and the point at which production outstripped discovery in the early 80s. That's an important point because the first stage, if you will, of coming up on peak oil is the point at which you're producing oil faster than you're finding it. That global oil reserves, the amount of oil that we have in the Earth's crust, is decreasing at that point. At least the amount that we know is there. It's no longer increasing, we're no longer discovering it faster than we're pulling it out. But ultimately, peak oil is about when the rate at which we harvest oil, extract oil, is going to go down. So here we see some projections for when peak oil is going to occur. These are a number of different types of oil and from different sources, but the top line there shows the trends in increasing oil production, a plateau on around the 2010 line, and then a slow gradual decrease after that. We are already undershooting the production predictions for this pessimistic peak oil scenarios, which expected production to increase until about 2020. By the way, these are production scenarios that are being put together by the petroleum industry itself, from internal reports by BP, being chief amongst the resources that I used in the preparation of this talk. And I'll link that at the end. But these are not anti-oil crusaders that are putting together this information. These are actual petroleum engineers and economists themselves trying to map out as well as possible their future oil production. Now, when I said that we were undershooting that pessimistic value, I'm referring to the fact that oil production peaked on around 2005 or 2006 and has been holding more or less steady for the last 5 years. Now, you could argue that that's due to the global recession driving down demand, but that's extremely unlikely, considering the high price of oil. If you use price as being a signal of the relationship between supply and demand of oil, then consumption of oil remains high as it ever has been, and is in fact increasing seemingly without bound, particularly in the growing economies in China and India. And the price for Brent crude, which is a benchmark type of crude oil, remained over $100 a barrel for essentially the entirety of 2011, something that was considered impossible as early as 6 or 7 years ago. These are unprecedentedly high prices of petroleum, and producers of petroleum would have increased their production if they were physically capable of doing so, and they haven't. Oil production has remained flat for the last 5 or 6 years. This is the strongest evidence I can think of that we have reached peak oil, and oil production is going to start decreasing soon. What are the consequences of this? I'd like to return to the Survey of World Energy Resources from the World Energy Council. The world will not finally run out of oil for very many years, if ever, but the onset of decline may prove to be a discontinuity of historic proportions. The transition to decline threatens indeed to be an age of great economic and geopolitical tension. I'd like to congratulate the World Energy Council on their art of the understatement. What we're dealing with here is literally the life's blood of an industrial world economy. And we've all felt the economic pinch of rising oil prices, increasing the cost of consumer goods, the cost of food, the cost of transportation, the cost of electricity, the cost of everything. As oil prices increase and oil availability decreases, we're going to see an increase in geopolitical tensions surrounding those countries that do have continued proven oil reserves. You might have noticed that there's a little bit of tension around Iran recently, and I'm sure that has nothing to do whatsoever with their proven oil reserves. No, of course not. And we can also expect to see an impact on global food production going into the future, as petroleum is a key feedstock for modern industrialized agriculture, both as the raw material from which a lot of chemical fertilizers are produced, as well as fuel for tractors and trucks to transport the food. So how is this all going to interact? Global climate change will present humanity with tremendous challenges. Violent weather will damage our infrastructure, and vast portions of our agriculture will need to be moved into currently undeveloped areas of the earth, seeking areas under the new climate regime that are amenable to the large-scale, intensive agriculture required to sustain our population. Meanwhile, peak oil, if unmanaged, will deny us the resources to deal with climate change in a meaningful way. We will be lacking the industrial oomph necessary to deal with climate change just when we need it most. And in fact, a oil shock situation may remove petroleum from the markets altogether, long before they are actually physically depleted. This is a shortcoming of capitalist systems, in that as oil becomes increasingly less available, prices increase, and we eventually deal with demand destruction, as people are forced out of the energy market to one degree or another, resulting in oil becoming an unextractable commodity. It will require more outlay in terms of energy to get at the remaining oil than is possible to get in terms of profit from selling that oil on the open market. So a capitalist system could literally have people starving on the surface of the earth with utilizable, extractable petroleum still in the crust. This is an inefficiency and a crisis of capitalism that we've seen before, and this is simply going to be one of the worst iterations of it. So the point that I have here is that only a coordinated international effort, placing the needs of people before profit, can allow humanity to face this twofold emergency. And I'll be frank, it was this realization that caused me to get off my socialist armchair, as it were, and become a communist, and specifically a member of the Communist Party. Is my concern that only an international coordinated effort to retool our economy to face climate change, to deal with petroleum extraction on an egalitarian way, targeted towards utilizing a limited and key resource for humanity in the most egalitarian way possible, and not for the enrichment of a handful of large corporations, that led me to believe that only a Marxist-Leninist philosophy, only that sort of economic structure, can allow humanity to support our large population in the coming times. And with that, I'd like to leave you with a few resources that I used in compiling this talk. I highly recommend looking at the International Panel on Climate Change's Fourth Assessment Report, which is available for free online and in just about every public library in the country. The World Energy Council Survey of Energy Resources in 2007 was extremely valuable to me in putting together projections for oil production over the next couple of decades. And Beyond Petroleum's own Statistical Review of World Energy from 2011, which has the most up-to-date numbers available until the 2012 report comes out, that is, for historical oil production in most of the countries of the world. And I'd like to thank everyone for sticking with me this long, and watching this video, and thinking about some of the stuff that I had to say. And I would like to invite the CPUSA to have an internal discussion as to how the Communist Party can make the coming issues of climate change and peak oil a central concern for our environmental activism. This is going to be the single biggest challenge to face humanity, the single biggest crisis to face capitalism of the coming century. And it's extremely important that the Communist Party think about how it is that we're going to deal with this, and how it is we're going to show people how to deal with the coming crises and protect themselves, their families, and their comrades. So thank you very much, and let's have a discussion.